Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the first keynote lecture of the 14th Labor Economics meeting. Today, we are privileged to have a lecturer from Almudena Sevilla. Thanks a lot for giving this talk, Almudena. Almudena Sevilla is a professor in economics and public policy at UCL, co-director of the UCL Center of TimeU Research, and is currently the chair of the Royal Economic Society Women's Committee. She has held positions at Queen Mary University, University of Oxford, the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Essex, and the Congressional Budget Office in Washington, D.C. She received her PhD from Brown University in 2004 in the fields of family and population economics and econometrics. She joined ESA as a research fellow in May 2012. Almudena is an applied microeconomist whose research focuses on the areas of gender, child development, and human capital. She has published in top journals in the fields of economics, demography, and sociology, including the American Economic Review Papers and Proceedings, the Journal of the European Economic Association, European Economic Review, the Economic Journal, Demography, and the Journal of Marriage and Family, among others. She is specialized in the analysis of gender issues, focusing on the analysis of gender differences in the usage of time by couples, paying special attention to childcare and housework activities. In this context, she has published several papers using gender and social norms as explanatory factors in gender differentials in housework and childcare activities. She has also used culture, understood as attitudes and social norms, to explain divorce decisions and the academic results, specifically the math gender gap of boys and girls. She has recently published important analysis of the situation of women in the economics profession. Almudena has also initiated a line of research about COVID. Several of her published papers examine how COVID has changed the time allocation decision of couples, including the labor supply of mothers and the distribution of childcare and housework tasks. Also, she has studied how non-pharmaceutical interventions have affected mortality and how lockdown has affected the behavioral infection risks. Furthermore, she has analyzed how school closures have affected children's outcomes, focusing on the inequality of human capital formation. Well, now, on a personal note, I first met Almudena in 2006 when I was doing my PhD, and I worked with her in ICER at the University of Essex. From the very beginning, she showed me the importance of analyzing gender issues and gender inequalities. And since then, we have maintained a professional relationship and become friends. I have learned much economics and econometrics from her. And I consider her one of my co-supervisors of my thesis. She introduces me to the analysis of time use, and since then we have been working together, publishing several papers, including in the European Economic Review and Demography. In this work, we have always focused on men and women as different groups, analyzing gender gaps in time use with all its implications. So Almudena, I can only thank you for making me a better economist, a better researcher, and hopefully a better person. So now I give the floor to Almudena, who will be presenting for around 45 minutes, and then we will have time for some questions. So for questions, please use the chat during the presentation. If you have any question, please use the chat to write the question, and I will tell Almudena your question after the talk. So please, Almudena, it's your time. So go ahead.
Thank you, Nato. I'm a bit overwhelmed with your introduction. I wasn't expecting such a personal introduction, but I have to say I've learned so much from you, and I'm so happy that I received, more than 15 years ago, this email from Alberto, Molina, who is a professor at Zaragoza, telling me that he had this student and whether he could come and visit. And I think it was one of the best things that happened to me as a junior researcher at the time, to have the luxury to work with someone as motivated as you were, and you continue to be, of course. So it's an honor to be here today and to be able to give back to you, and also to Zaragoza, who have always been so welcoming to me since that initial email from Alberto, whom I didn't know at the time. It's been you who've come and visit me and worked, but also Miriam Marcem, who is also a professor at the department now, and more recently, Marina Morales, who's her PhD at Zaragoza and was visiting UCL before all this thing with COVID happened. So I think we've created a very nice and fruitful relationship, both, as you say, at the professional, but also at the personal level. So I really thank you, and of course the organizers of the conference, for inviting me here today and giving me the opportunity to give a little bit back to the university and to this to the labor economics society in Spain. So let me share my screen. I think it's in presentation mode now. Yeah. So today I'm going to be talking about several papers. One of them, the one that I'm going to be focusing on, is a paper with Miriam Marcen and Marina Morales, both at Zaragoza, and Catalina Muedo, who is in California. So it's the right paper to present. It's very current, but it's also close to my heart because it's with co-authors from the local organizers. So really the question that I want to explore in this presentation, and that I've covered in several papers, is the role of childcare needs on explaining the COVID-19 SHE session. So what is this SHE session? Well, there has been a lot of discussion among labor economists as to whether this time is different. And I think there is already quite a lot of evidence to support the notion that it is indeed different. So we know that economic crisis usually affects men. They usually economic crisis imply labor demand shocks. So lots of industries or sectors closed. And usually, or in the last economic crisis, it's been male-dominated sectors like manufacturing that have been affected the most. So male unemployment rose to a greater extent than female employment, for example. Now, what has happened with the COVID crisis is not only do we have labor demand shocks that are more likely to affect female dominated sectors like retailing or leisure, but also, and this is really different from the crisis, is that we've experienced huge negative labor supply shocks. And these labor supply shocks have come from the increases in the demand for childcare time from households. And we would argue particularly for women or mothers. Now, given that the title of the keynote is Lessons from Gender Economics, let me bring a question into the broader area of equality or gender equality in economics. So as economists, we want to maximize the limited resources. And female talent is one of those resources, not just female talent, but of course male talent in general. We can talk about equity and what is fair or not, but we know that different people have different notions of what equity means. So really the discussion within economics has to do with the efficiency notion, the fact that a better allocation of talent allocated to those activities where they are more productive, ultimately increases productivity and increases economic growth. So to the extent that women have been from the crisis for reasons that are unrelated to the market, so say to spend more time doing childcare and have been expected to do more of the childcare, the increase in childcare as a result from this crisis, nothing to do with the economy, but it has to do with gender roles, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. That is an inefficient allocation of talent. So that would be my argument. And there is a nice paper by Eric Hurst and co-authors published in Econometrica, where they show that since the 1960s to the early 2000s, the increases in female labor force participation, and in particular how women have been allocated to the right or to the most productive occupations where they are most productive, it has contributed to about 20-40% of the increase in GDP over this period in the US. So allocating talent is what this this presentation is all about. Okay, so this is the bigger picture as to why we should care about the differential effects of the crisis. So what do we know, and is there a she section? So here, this is a paper by Alan et al., a recent paper. They have several papers on the topic, but I thought this comes from Dobke's presentation at the CIHO about a month ago, and I think this table is telling. So what the first row indicates is the declines in overall employment since the crisis started, I think to September 2020. And what we see is that countries like USA, Canada, or Spain, who is the previous to last column, have experienced declines in employment of 5 and 7%. And then what the basic gender gap, that is the employment losses from women. And we see that women have experienced higher employment losses than men. So all those coefficients there are negative for most of the, and particularly high for Spain and the US. And again, for those with children, there seemed to be a much higher employment loss. Okay, particularly for those individuals with school-age kids. So that's the fourth row. So we see big coefficients there and very negative. And that includes Spain as well. So it's 2.33 for Spain, 4.23 for the US, greater for the US, but also in Spain. They go on in this Spain, they say, well, 21% of the gender gap can be attributed to the childcare channel. So families devoting more time to childcare as to work. But most of it comes from the occupational channel, basically the hit to the economy, and some sectors closing down that seem to have affected women to a greater extent. Now, what they sent is an accounting exercise, but it's very difficult from this accounting exercise to actually understand the channels that are driving these differentials across households with children and households without children, or men and women. Okay, it could be It could be that schools are closed, but it may also be due to the fact that there is a health crisis, and parents may be worried about sending their kids to school. And that is understanding what the channels are is important for the design of policies. So what the first paper that I want to talk about today is the paper with Miriam and Marina from Zaragoza and Catalina Amuedo, who is of California. And in this paper, we study whether school closures in the US have affected parental labor supply. And we try to get to the channels by looking at different groups of individuals that have or not childcare needs. Let's see what time it is. Okay, so we're doing fine. So let me start with the motivation for this work. The COVID pandemic was unexpected, and government really debated what most effective measures to flatten the pandemic curve without hurting the economy. In the US, school closures happened in a staggered manner very soon when the pandemic started. And in Europe as well. In school closures is a very controversial measure. So up to this day, and things are already changing with the Delta variant, the idea was that children didn't get sick and weren't transmitters of the virus, or as much as adults. And, you know, closing the schools can have very negative consequences, not just for parental labor supply, which is what we do in this paper, but also to children's learning. And I'm not going to talk about that aspect of school closures here. Another line of research that I have in during this time. So doing this is we exploit the unanticipated closure of schools following the onset of the pandemic to estimate the impact of school closures on parental labor supply. So we're trying to get to the causal effects of school closures on parental labor supply. Now, the US is a great experimental field to do this kind of a study, because it's not centralized as in other European countries, and decisions were often made at the school district, and there is large variation as to how schools reacted. And we're going to focus at the beginning of the pandemic. So we're going to look at a period up to August. So 4 months after the pandemic started. And we're gonna gather data on school closures at the district level. So the units of who decides whether schools close or not is generally the school district level, which is a very small unit within counties, and counties sit in the states, right? So it's a relatively small unit. And then because our data on labor supply is at the individual level, but we don't have to which country this individual, to which the school district this individual belong, we have the state level of the individual. We're going to reach variation within states from the school district level data and construct a state level index of school closures that takes into account the share of the population affected by school closures in particular states, and also the number of days that schools were closed in a given month. And we're gonna use that index to try and get the causal effect of closing schools on individual employment. And we have data from January 2019 to May 2020. We're gonna do it at the state and month, but we have individual data for every state and month. And we're gonna use the difference in difference models, where we look at parents with young school-aged children from 6 to 12. And crucially, we're going to be accounting for any other policy measures that were taken at that time. So things like the business closures or things like lockdowns. Now, a challenge in estimating the causal effect of school closures on parental labor supplies. Obviously, school closures were not adopted in a vacuum, but rather in response to the spread of the pandemic. To address, we account for other policies that were adopted simultaneously. We also supplement our primary analysis with an event study examining parental labor supply before and after the adoption of these closures to make sure there wasn't any pre-trend that can contaminate our findings. We also explored the differential impact of the school closures on parental labor supply based on the childcare demands of households. So we look at parents with, for example, older kids that whose labor demand at home hasn't increased as much as parents with the smaller kids. Okay. So in a nutshell, and then I'll go on a little bit with the analysis, we found that the school closures reduced weekly work hours among fathers and mothers of young children with 11% and 15%. And other social distancing measures, such as business closures or safer at home orders, which are basically lockdowns, didn't affect work hours, but we do find that they are associated with employment shortfalls at the extensive margin. So, so we do several robustness, obviously, and heterogeneity effects on channels. And we find that school closures lowered the labor supply of mothers unable to telework and who were not considered essential workers. And also of mothers who did not have to care or didn't have any adult in the home, apart from the father, to help her with the care of the children. But this is not as strong for fathers. Okay, so this is suggestive that there is some gender norms playing about here. We also very recently updated the data on labor supply and labor outcomes to the last month, and we assess the impact of early school closures on the longer run labor market outcomes. And we find that the early closure of schools have some damaging impacts on maternal labor supply to this day. Okay, so how does this paper contribute to the literature? Well, the first and foremost, this paper is related to the huge literature that examines parental labor responses, labor supply response to childcare shocks. There is a very big literature talking about childcare availability or childcare expansion. So what happens when childcare, so childcare centers children from 0 to 6, we increase the supply of those centers. What happens to maternal labor supply? So that is a literature that is well studied, but much less attention has been paid to children that are in school age. There is only one paper that we have been able to find that looks at, well, exploits the unanticipated nature of strikes on teachers how that affects maternal labor supply. This is Jaume and Villain in 2018. It is a working paper, and they do this for Argentina. In our case, we're using a much greater shock, and we're looking at the US, and the shock is different. It's not late teacher strike, but actually the COVID crisis. And of course, we also contribute to the literature assessing the impact of COVID-19 and in particular the policies that have been taken on parental labor supply. So there are a few papers that were done early on in the pandemic. Most of them do not necessarily distinguish or are able to distinguish the school closures from other policies. So they put them together in their policy measures. There is a paper by Russell and Son in 2020 that analyzes childcare center closures in the US and finds evidence that unemployment rates of mothers of young children increase substantially in the short and the long run. So our paper looks at school closures and looks at a very similar question as this paper. So let me talk a little bit about the paper itself. So just to give you an idea of what the institutional framework is. In the US, as I was saying before, the decisions on school closures were often made at the school district level. In some instances, they were made at the county or the state level. And they were made from the start of the pandemic in February 2020 at very different rates across the school districts. So we have a lot of variation within this time. The school closures began in February 26 in Snohomish County in the state of Washington. This is where the first case of COVID was detected in the US. And at the beginning of March, a total of 347 counties out of 3,000 had at least one of the school districts having closed, so the schools. Okay. The latest county to close the schools was Oneida County in the state of Idaho on March 2020. And the schools remain closed thereafter until the end of the academic year. So this is the period that we are going to concentrate on here. We're going to use CPS data, current population survey, which take place during the week of the 19th of each month. Our main sample consists of working age individuals, 16 to 64, and we focus on 2 partnered households with school-age children between 6 and 12, so children in primary school. And we're going to focus on 3 labor market outcomes. We're going to look at whether or not the person is employed, whether it is employed but did not work. So here we try to capture all those that were offered furloughed, which means basically you don't have to go to work, but you're not unemployed, you're still earning a salary, and weekly hours of work of those that are employed. So we're going to merge with our school closures data that comes from the Education Week, which collected all this data at the school district level during this period. Now, because schools took place at distinct geographic levels, and our individuals, we only have the information for the state, we are going to follow some of our work actually and construct an index of school closures that varies between 0 and 1. And that reflects the intensity of school closures for an individual living in state S in a month T. Okay, and this index basically is going to take into account how many counties had a school closed in a given state, for how many days, and how many people lived in those counties. So at the state level, we're going to have a sense of how many people were affected and for how long by the school closure. Okay, so this is our main policy variable. And we do a similar thing for the social distance measures that we have. We have 4 social distance measures from declaration of a state of emergency, partial business closures, non-essential business closures, and safer at home orders. So again, we aggregate that at the state level and taking into account how many people live in the state and for how many days the policy was in place for each month. And this table here gives us a little bit of an idea of the time variation in the index. Now, remember, we also have geographical variation, which I'm going to show in a minute. So this is just the time variation. So the first, so the top panel shows the school closure index, the first row, and we see that up until February was 0 in all the United States. So this is before COVID started, and the same for the rest of the measures. By March, the index starts getting positive, 0.039. And in the same with the non-pharmaceutical index that encompasses all the 4 policies, mainly because of the emergency declaration. None of the others had taken effect over this time. In April, the index has increased a lot for most states, so it's closer to 1. And in May, all states had schools closed. Now, to give a sense of the geographical variation in the United States, so what we have here is darker colors are those states in the lower quantile of the index. Lighter colors are those states at the top quantile of the index. So it shows where states were in the school closure index distribution. And not only we see more white and more lighter color at the end, but also the variation across the states over this period, which is what this graph wants to show. It's remarkable. So it's not that states that started to close the schools very early on continued to be the ones that were closed schools later on. Okay, there is a big variation across this time, and here we're just showing the April and May. Okay, so what about our dependent variables? Just graphically, just to show you the trends. So the yellow vertical line shows May 2020. The last, but we have up to May 2021. This is what you can see here, and if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about that. So we see these big drops. The blue line is employment, the red line is weekly hours of work. And we see this big drop in February, March, with a little bit of a recovery after May. Okay, so this is what the data looks like, and what we're trying to do in this paper is to understand to what extent this is due to closures. So this is our sample. Well, so the graph shows 80% was employment losses for men and 14% for women. Hours dropped by 3% for men, 1.7% for women. So here we can already see the gender asymmetries in employment rates. So we use a difference in difference model where our dependent variable is going to be each of the employment variables that I've been discussing. And our main policy variable is the school closure. We're also going to control for any other measures and of the any individual characteristics in the data. We also control for state and month fixed effects. We'll do some event study just to check that there weren't any pre-trends. And these are the main results. So first two columns show the effect on employment of school closures. That's the first row. And there is no effect on employment, but there is a negative and significant effect on hours that is slightly higher for women, but these coefficients are not statistically significant. And the other measures that are more likely to affect the demand for labor, and it makes sense what we have because they affect employment. So they create negative labor demand shocks that reduce employment opportunities. And again, a little bit higher for women than for men. Now, these are our event studies. I'm not going to go in great detail here, but we see that there doesn't seem to be any pre-trend for any of the variables. Maybe for the did not work last week for men, which I haven't really show here, but we can do at some other time. So the next part of the paper tries to get to the mechanisms that are behind these effects that we find, and the literature, we know that women are more likely to look after children. So trying to understand whether women and men reacted differently depending on the competing work and childcare responsibilities. So we're going to look at the ability to telework, whether workers are essential workers or non-essential workers. And we're also going to look at the differences by household ability to care for children and childcare needs. So we're going to look at whether there is a presence of another adult in the household and whether that makes a difference to the effect of school closures, whether the partner is at home, or whether there are no childcare needs, so households with older children, and we're going to use that as a placebo test to make sure that our results come from this childcare channel. So here, here we present the results for the differences by competing work responsibilities, looking at those individuals whose occupation or whose work is amenable to telework or not. And what we see here is that for those women that cannot telework, we do find effects on employment. And the effects on hours are much higher for those women that cannot telework, okay? And that doesn't seem to affect men as much. Similarly here, women that are essential workers or not, when we separate the sample, that's when we start to see employment effects of the school closures for essential and non-essential workers, but much higher for the non-essential workers, okay? We also see that the reduced in hours is driven solely by those women that are not essential workers, okay, as you would expect. Okay, yeah, I think this is what I just said, okay. And then we're going to look at whether these households have any help for their childcare needs or whether they don't have any childcare needs at all. And what we see here, so the first panel, panel A, presents whether there are other households, other adults in the household or not. And we see that it is when there is no other households, or no other adults in the household, that the effects on hours work happen. Okay, so again, suggesting that it is this childcare channel that is driving the results. Okay, and then we'll look at, so let me skip this. Yeah, so So then we look at, in panel E, we look at two partnered households with children that are older, and arguably they don't need as much childcare as younger children, with either with help with homeschooling or just supervising. And we don't find any effects here for this sample of parents. So again, it suggests that all the effect comes from this excess demand on childcare from school closures. So where are we now? So it seems that there have been recoveries in employment and work hours, as we see from this graph between February and March 2021. Particularly, men's employment and hours have increased, but not as much as previous to COVID. For women, the recovery, at least in hours, seems to have happened. And what we want to do here is to see whether these early school closures had any long-lasting effect on employment and labor market hours for men and women as of now. So here we follow Correa et al. And look at the effect of early school closures on today's employment. Of course, a lot of things have happened, so these estimates cannot necessarily be interpreted in a causal way. But it's interesting that doing this analysis, what comes out clearly are huge declines in female working hours from having been exposed to early school closures, even after a year after the schools closed. So let me talk a little bit more about the mechanisms. I have about 10 more minutes. So this is where my other work that looks at household division of labor comes in. So I've been working on what households have been doing during this time. So the first paper that I just presented seemed to suggest that childcare needs are the driving mechanism of these effects that we find from school closures on labor market outcomes. And what I want to do now is to just give you a brief overview of what goes on inside households, what has been going on inside the households that we study over this period. And just to give you a bit of a background for those of you not familiar with time use data and household economics, there's a very nice paper. I think I'm very proud of this paper. It is a paper with Nacho, where we have a great overview of household division of labor for many countries and over a long period of time. We look at housework and childcare. We also look at leisure and work. But just to look at these two main activities, which is what are the important ones here in the context of the school closures, just to give you an idea of the magnitudes before the crisis. This is again an average across all the countries that we have. Men spent about 12 hours of housework per week. Women more than double that, so it's 28 hours. These are not small numbers. Childcare per week is 2 for men and 8 for women. So again, it's a substantial amount of time, particularly for women, that are spent in these activities. What has happened is that the demand on women's housework and childcare responsibilities on their time has increased enormously. And this is what we try to measure in these two papers for the UK. So my paper with Sarah Smith from Bristol, published in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, looks at this question. concentrates on housework, and another paper with the IFS, with an IFS team, also looks at this question from a different perspective, also in the UK. And there is a huge number of papers that have looked at this issue over the past year for different countries. And I forget here to mention Sonia Orifiz's paper. So of course, she's one of the contributors to this literature, and Libertad González and Ferrer for the case of Spain, who both of them will be presented at the conference. So I won't be talking much about it. So just to give you a very short, in the last 5 minutes, a very short overview of what we do in this paper. So the paper with Sarah, we collected data for about 4,000 observations during the lockdown in the UK. So the lockdown meant, I don't need to tell Spaniards or Spanish audience what it meant. So we stayed at home in the UK. We were allowed to work, which was a great advantage. Schools were closed. So this was between the 5th and the 11th of May. That's when we collected data. We were in the middle of the lockdown. And what we're trying to assess here is whether the pre-pandemic division of labor stayed the same after or during the lockdown, after the increase in childcare demands. So we asked questions about how households divided their housework before, or actually childcare time before COVID. And then we asked questions about the demands for extra childcare, so for additional childcare. And we wanted to see whether households had become more equal or less equal for that additional childcare. Okay, so we know from the diaries in the UK that before the pandemic hit, women were devoting 2 hours per day to childcare, fathers about 45 minutes per day. This is using the UK time use data, which collects individuals' response to during 24 hours what they're doing. Okay, so that comes from there. Post-COVID, when we asked about the additional childcare, women reported to be doing 4.5 hours per day and men 3.2 hours per day. So what we find in this paper is that actually the division of labor in terms of childcare is very similar before and after the pandemic. So the additional childcare was divided in the same way that the previous childcare had been divided across households. But then what we do, and it's interesting because we're trying to get to these gender norms here and this efficiency of allocation of resources. What we do is to look at how the pandemic affects men and women differently, depending on their labor force status. Okay, so here we have women that are at work, women that are furloughed, women that work from home, women that are furloughed, and women that are not employed. And what we see is that women's hours in childcare do not seem to vary much, at least for these three groups of women, do not seem to vary much regarding their employment status. Women do a lot of childcare, regardless of whether they're working from home, not, etc. However, for men, it does vary a lot. Okay, so it suggests that for men, there seems to be an efficient allocation of childcare, whereas that doesn't necessarily exist for women. Women are expected to provide this childcare provision, regardless of where they are in terms of labor participation. In the paper with the IFS team, we collected data. In this time, we collected data in a very specific way. So what we did was a time diary, more or less the same period. But here we asked people to give us information about what they were doing at every hour of the day. And they could list as many activities, or there was a list of 10 activities for every hour slot. Okay, so what we try to, so we have here for the sample is the time or the hours loads in which some kind of childcare was done for fathers and mothers. Okay, so fathers report that for about, for 8 hours, in 8 hours of the day, they were doing some childcare. For mothers, it is 10 hours that there is some childcare going on. Housework, again, 2 hours in the day, men were doing some kind of housework. For mothers, it's about 4 hours. And paid work, okay, it's the opposite. Fathers were doing paid work for some paid work in at least 4 hours of the day, mothers in at least 2 hours. So this is quite low, but of course we have unemployed individuals here. This is the aggregate. But what is interesting from this is that it allows us to see the sequence of activities throughout the day, okay? And if we look at the childcare figure, which is the third figure at the top, it shows that childcare was done throughout the day. So childcare was done for many hours, lots, but also it's very much distributed throughout, okay? The same happens with housework, although the level of hours or of time is lower, but some other activities like sleep is only done in certain times of the day, right? At the beginning or at the end. The same thing with leisure. Leisure is done at the end of the day, okay? So this shows the nature of interruptions that happen due to childcare and housework, and they are much higher for women and much more uniform across the day than they are for men, which seems to be a little bit bumpy at the end. Okay, and there are some papers that are beginning to appear showing that these kind of interruptions can be harmful for productivity. So really thinking about working from home, for example, moving onwards, we also need to take account of the fact that productivity may decrease if there is some childcare to be done at the same time, particularly for women. So I think I'm gonna stop here, and I'm gonna thank you again for having me here today. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Almudena, for your very interesting talk. So I have first, I'm going to start with the questions. Well, the first question is, have you thought of the possibility of including like variations in mortality rates at the state level for this would be like a measure of the intensity of the COVID pandemic at the state level, right? So maybe you could use variations from in March in comparison to March last year to see how the impact or the intensity of the COVID pandemic at the state level, and because you have the impact of school closures on labor supply, but other factors that you are including in your regression. So maybe this could be included as an additional factor, right? And my second, this is for personal interest. How do you measure telework in the your robustness check? Is for the whole week or for 2, 3, 4 weeks? I mean, I would like to see how do you define telework in your paper, because I'm really interested in this topic of telework, right? So thank you.
So okay, so let me start with that before I forget all the other questions. So telework, let me see, ability to care. So telework, we define using so this is essential. Okay, so we use the standard occupation classification, SOC, and the CPS occupational codes. And that are provided by the BLS. So this is what we use for telework. I think, yeah, with yes. So we basically we use the standard occupation classification. It's already established what's work or not, and actually, or what types of jobs can be teleworked or not. So this is information that is already there, is published in this standard occupation classification. So
Okay.
according to this, about 40% of fathers are able to telework and 55% of mothers are able to telework. So it's not, there are other classifications, and there's been quite a few papers looking at all classifications, and I think we do some kind of robustness check at some point, but these classifications seem to be the most complete for our purposes, and you know, it was easy given the data that we were using, the CPS. It was very easy to assign telework or not because of the way the data was coded.
Okay.
But yeah, we can talk a bit more about this if you want.
Okay.
And about your other question, so that's a very good question. Actually, we haven't controlled directly for the for mortality rates at the state level. That wouldn't be very hard to do, and would capture a lot of the health shock per se here. I guess we're capturing other policies, and I mean the worry really, of course, it is, you know, school closures happened at the same time that the health shock, but really the important thing is whether these two were correlated. So this, we try to address that using our event study analysis, right, to see whether there was some pre-trends prior to the health shock. But yeah, we should account for that as well. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to read all the questions that are in the chat. Okay. Laura Ospido, thanks for the talk. Almudena, do you think the small additional time fathers spend with their kids during the lockdown will have any persistent effect, or as soon as they would come back to work, that will disappear?
Okay, I think let me repeat the question to make sure that I got it right. So okay. Whether the effect that we saw during the lockdown, whether on the household division of labor, I guess, is going to persist in the longer run, is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I think that's the $1 million question. We need you know, to follow these households over time to see whether gender roles have changed one way or another, right? So at the beginning of and before these studies appeared, actually my study, the one with Sarah Smith, where we say, look, households are sharing more or less the same way that they were sharing before, right? So the ratio before was 65-35, now it's 63-37. This is not significantly different. So it's not that women are taking more and doing more of the share, right? But of course, the time is much higher now, or was much higher for women then. So the effects of that extra time can actually be worse than when the demands on their time was lower. And so it may be that households you know, continue to share in the same way. Ideally, we want households to become more equal and to be driven by economic factors and not social norms factors, right? Which is what seems to be happening here. And we don't see that going on at the moment. And so I don't think that we are seeing any changes in how households are dividing their childcare or their housework. And I think this is consistent with what we know from parental leave policies. So the expectations here were that as fathers stay at home and they realize of how much time mothers are spending doing housework and childcare and what it takes to do it, that they would chip in and learn as well, right? So either learning or the ostracism associated with housework or childcare may go. And what we know from parental leave policies is that fathers take on the leave, and then things go back to the old regime after a few years. COVID was a much higher shock than the usual 15 days that fathers take. But I think it is too early to say, but certainly the short run effects do not seem to point to a better division or a more equal division of labor, and I want to say more efficient as well within the household. But this is certainly something I want to look at, and the American Time Use Survey is going to be a great resource for that, because it's been collecting data during the pandemic and for many years before that. So thank you, Laura.
You have, Almudena, you have another question from Rosa Castro, right? Do you want to read it or?
I don't see. I don't see it. Sorry. Can you read it?
Is there any difference in the type of school closure? Because she says that in Spain there were schools in which there were online classes, while in other didn't.
Yeah, so I didn't. Yeah, this is a really good question. And this is the reason why we concentrate on the very short period right after the COVID hit, because the school closures were to some extent much more homogeneous during that period than what they have been thereafter. So in the US, the situation has been much more chaotic over the last year than was it has been, for example, in Spain, where schools have remained open, although depending on the community, Comunidad Autónoma, there have been, there has been some variation. But in the States, there has been great variation. So in order to, and this is why we, even if we had the data, which doesn't exist actually for this period, for this most recent period, it would have been really hard to understand, is it coming, school closures in some districts is very different than school closures in other districts. In this period, schools were not prepared. Of course, more schools would have been better prepared than others. We don't have that information, but at least we're minimizing that problem by concentrating on a period that was very, very shortly after the pandemic hit. And the way schools reacted was much more homogeneous than what has been happening later on, particularly in the United States. So yeah, that's a very good question.
Okay, is there more questions? No? So I think now it's time to finish the talk. So sorry. The Spanish Association of Labor Economics and the organizers of the meeting are very grateful for your talk and your great presentation. And I also have to thank the association and the organizers of the meeting to invite me to introduce you to the audience. So thank you very much. And if you have further questions, maybe you can write Almudena directly by email. Yeah. And I think she will be delighted to,
of course, anytime,
reply
yeah.
all of your questions.
And this is work in progress as well. So any comments, questions, very, very welcome.
Okay, so thanks all the participants also to the session, because it was very interesting. And well, see you around and bye-bye.
Bye, Nacho. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Amorena.